everyone here at the back? Can everyone at the front take one step forward and let a few more people in at the back? That would be absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Good work. Actually works. So you can come on in at the back. So hello and welcome. My name's Polly Curtis. I am Chief Executive at Demos, and this is my first conference as Chief Executive. It's absolutely lovely.
A real practical example of devolution, pushing power down to communities. We're also a founding member of the Community Wealth Fund Alliance, which is a cross-sectoral campaign. It brings together MPs, businesses, local authorities, charities to campaign to ensure that a significant portion of the next wave of dormant assets that the government is consulting on the use of at the moment is committed to rebuilding the social fabric of communities across the country that have often seen their hearts stripped out through the loss of places to meet, through the loss of shops, pubs, clubs, assembly rooms, the sorts of things that used to be the lifeblood of many, many places. And we all know what those places are, where those places are, and what they feel like. And I think that feeling that something needs to be done has been it's been a current that's run right through this conference. Whilst the headlines outside of the conference bubble and the conference inner bubbles has been around turmoil in the economy, actually I think some of the highest levels of energy, some of the most important debates have been happening in rooms where people have been talking about how we get down to the practical business of rebuilding places, rebuilding neighbourhoods, communities, housing estates, towns. That's stuff that I know Lisa has had on her agenda well before this brief, and I can recall talking to her about this, probably almost a decade ago. It's been right at the heart of your mission. It's why we're so delighted to support this event. Polly, really looking forward to what's going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation, and then maybe some wine and canapes after, yeah?
Definitely some wine and canapes after. We are going to have a really relaxed conversation about politics, about conference, and about your life, really. So I thought I'd start by just asking you to kind of set the political scene, the moment we're in now. Given the huge events of the last week, what is the opportunity for Labour in this moment?
Well, first of all, when Polly gets you into a room with lots of people and says just relax and have a glass of wine, this is the moment when politicians get into all sorts of trouble, so stand by, everybody. It's been an extraordinary few weeks, hasn't it? It's been an extraordinary few months, extraordinary few years, extraordinary few weeks in British politics. I think we've seen a total shift in the government's approach, and the dividing lines between us and the Tories, I don't think, have ever been clearer. You've essentially got a national crisis, and you've got a government that thinks that it can run this country and grow the economy by the few, for the few, and you've got a Labour Party that intends to form the next government that is saying it takes a nation. If you continue to write off most people and most places from being able to make a contribution to Britain's future, the country can't succeed. Most major economists call it the equivalent of trying to fly a jet on one engine. There's talent, there's assets, there's potential, there's contribution in every part of this country, and we've got to utilise it and draw on it in order for the country to succeed. Now, what does that mean? Well, you heard a little bit about it from Keir. You'll hear more from Keir, but from Keir over the weekend, and from Rachel this morning, and from me this afternoon, and from Ed Miliband as well, about how the state is going to stop micromanaging millions of decisions, meddling in our job, communities' jobs, to rebuild this country from the ground up. We're going to hand power back to those communities, not just to local leaders, but to communities as well, to rebuild the social fabric, more powers over land and assets, so that we can protect the football clubs and the pubs and the historic buildings and the live music venues that make up a fabric of the place and support our local economy. And the state is going to stop doing our job and start doing its own. We'll invest, because there are 1 million jobs on the road to net zero, and we're going to invest to bring them to Britain, to the coastal and industrial towns that within living memory were the engine room of British industry, so that young people in those places can power us through the next century like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last. That's how you grow the economy, by getting money back into working people's pockets that goes back out onto our high streets and into our SMEs and our local businesses. That's how you build a country in which everyone has a stake in the outcome. a right to make a contribution and shares in the country's success. I felt so in despair last week when I sat with Yvette Cooper and Angela Rayner listening to that statement from Kwasi Kwarteng. And then I got here to Labour conference and I remembered that there is a movement, an army of people in every part of this country who have quietly, over the last decade, been building and fighting for something better. But right now in this country, I think that there's a recognition too that that moment has come. That what we need most of all right now is a government that backs us and supports us in order that every place and every person can succeed. And it's been a dark, divisive, difficult decade, but I don't think I've ever felt more hopeful about the prospect of what is on offer. Because that prize that is on offer is not just Labour winning the next election. It's not getting rid of the Tories. I didn't join the Labour Party because I hate the Tories. I joined the Labour Party because I know that this country can be better. And what is at stake is a country that I've believed in all of my life but never yet quite seen. That is what we've got our eye on, and that's why I've come to this conference to say, get ready, because we are going to build that, and we're going to do it the only way that counts, which is together.
Take a sip.
Every time I say buses, people have to drink.
Linking back to what Matt was saying, there was a line in your speech that jumped out to me. The people of our country are our greatest untapped asset. What does that mean? What does that look like to you? What's the potential?
Well, I nicked it actually from, like all the best political speeches, it's got a heavy dose of plagiarism in it. It was inspired by a man called Jimmy Reid, who was a great Scottish trade unionist who 50 years ago made a speech called Alienation, but it's often known as the rat race speech, because in it he said to Glasgow students that the country couldn't go on in the way that it was, with far too few people allowed the right to make a contribution. He said, I am convinced that the great majority of people go through life without even a glimmer of what they could have been or what they could have contributed. That is not just a tragedy, it is a social crime. And he went on to say, the people of our country, the wealth and resources and the assets in our North Sea are as nothing compared to the resource in the people of our country. Reject the rat race. A rat race is for rats. And that's what it means. It means that our people are the greatest asset that this country has. And we succeed when we recognise that. Think back to those great Reform and Labour governments. In 1945, you had the devastation of the war. And what did we do? We stepped forward and met the moment, because people said we won't put up with the same squalor and degradation that we've existed in before. We demand better, and we rose to that moment, and we built more council houses than any government in history, and we took all those public services back into common ownership, held by the people, for the people. And then we did it again in the 70s, and this is really personal to me, because my dad is from India, as some of you know, an immigrant to this country. My mum was raising us. My mum raised us as a single mum, with my dad's support, but in a lone parent household, and was one of the first women to go on to work in current affairs at Granada TV, and broke many glass ceilings even as she brought us up and was there for us all the way through. And there was this moment in the 70s where immigrant communities, women, working class families had ambitions that far outstripped the opportunities that were available to them. And that great reforming government led by Wilson just met that moment with the Race Relations Act, which is personal to me because my dad was involved in writing it, and the Equal Pay Act and comprehensive education. And then, of course, the last Labour government did something similar, rebuilding our schools and hospitals, but really transformative policies that changed our country for good. The national minimum wage, which gave dignity and respect and value to every single person in our country. The education maintenance allowance, which invested in young people and said, if you work hard and you try hard and you do hard, the system will pull in behind you and we will support you and you will succeed. Now, there are a few of my favourites, my personal highlights from the time of last Labour government, but this is our moment, and that's why when I said the people of our country are a great untapped asset, is because the next Labour government is going to come back and finish the job. We're going to unleash all that potential and all of that ambition, and just imagine what this country could do.
What will be the part of levelling up in that story? Given the shifting position in government, will you be Secretary of State for Levelling Up? Will Levelling Up still be what we talk about?
I would love a different job title. It doesn't fit on the ticker on the bottom of the screen when you're on the telly. I genuinely think I've got the stupidest job title in British politics. But the one bit of it that I dislike the most is the word shadow at the beginning. Whatever you call it, I intend to be the next Secretary of State. You know, they call it levelling up, we call it rebuilding Britain. And I think there is something quite important in that distinction, because attempts at regeneration, attempts at localism, attempts at reviving regional economies have been tried and failed by successive governments for 100 years. But the reason I believe that they've failed is because they've seen as nice to have add-ons when times are good. They haven't been seen as the way to renew and rebuild this country. These aren't local and regional issues. This is a national issue. It is at the heart of our national crisis. If we don't start to take seriously a great rebalancing of power and wealth and opportunity in this country, not one single part of this country is going to succeed. So, you know, call it rebuilding Britain, call it levelling up, I don't really care, although short would be good. We intend to do this, and we won't just be a levelling up department, will be a levelling up government.
As we were waiting for you at the beginning, I crowdsourced a few questions from the audience. They're really good. They're better than the ones I prepared. So one question was, how do we make sure in 20 years' time we're not regenerating the same areas we're regenerating now? Because the gentleman who asked this question said he's been regenerating the same places for a very long time with his organisation, and there just isn't progress.
I think that there was some synergy between the Michael Gove version of levelling up and our version of levelling up. Although I did think it was a bit rich that the worst thing to ever happen to education, Michael Gove, had been brought in to now repair some of the damage that he'd done over those 12 years. But there was some synergy in it, but there was a big difference as well. Really, the difference was that they saw this very much as about redistribution, whereas we see it as about contribution. That when you took those good jobs out of places like Wigan and Barnsley and replaced them with low-paid, insecure work that don't pay enough to raise a family on and don't offer a future for a lot of young people, what you took away from us was more than the spending power. You took away that sense of pride and purpose from people who, within living memory, had powered the world and had built this country's wealth and influence. And we don't just deserve that back, we demand that back. That's how the whole country can do well. So we've got to get power back into people's hands. We've got to get every part of Britain working again. It's one of the reasons why I said today we're really interested in ideas like the universal basic infrastructure, where every place is guaranteed a minimum infrastructure. Because we don't just want a national growth strategy. I've nicked this from Andy Haldane, who's been speaking to recently, who wrote the government's white paper on levelling up all this a few months ago when levelling up was still a thing for them. We want lots and lots of local growth strategies driven by local people who have a stake in the output and skin in the game. Because if I've learned one thing in 12 years of politics, and I learned this from mums who've got kids with special educational needs, many of whom have been through my surgery, regardless of background, regardless of educational levels, regardless of circumstance, those mums have battled and won over opaque, clunky, transparent, difficult systems in order to get things delivered for their kids. Because people who have a stake in the outcome and skin in the game, they try harder and they work harder and they do more and they think more creatively because they can do no other. And that's why when we say we're going to put power back into people's hands, that's why it matters. Because in the end, you're not getting enough out of this economy because you're not putting enough in, because you're writing off most people in most places and writing us out of the national story. And under the next Labour government, that is going to change.
On that idea of redistributing power, of rebalancing power, what does that actually look like? What's the mechanism? What's the power exchange that happens there from central to local?
Well, it starts with a basic level of respect from central government to local communities. Nothing offends me more than the prospect of a Chancellor sitting in Whitehall, drawing circles on a map, designating some areas functional economic areas and presumably the rest of us dysfunctional economic areas. handing powers and rights to some places and not others because they like the look of the mayor in one place and they don't like the look of the mayor in another. What does it mean? It means that a kid in Bolton can now get a bus to see friends and family and take up an apprenticeship, while a kid in Barnsley can't, because they decided that Andy Burnham could have powers to re-regulate his buses and other places haven't been granted the same courtesy. That's not good enough. So we start with a basic level of respect that governance arrangements in a democracy have to be driven by the people, that they have to reflect local identity and economic geography and transport systems and all of the other barriers that currently exist. And we say to areas, come to us with your governance arrangements, tell us what powers you need, and we will restore them back to you where they rightfully belong, to all areas, not just some. It's an approach that Mark Drakeford and Vaughan have been pioneering in Wales, restoring some fiscal autonomy as well to places so that they can make their own decisions about their own priorities and how to drive local growth, not have to dance to the tune of government ministers who are hundreds of miles away, sitting behind a desk in Whitehall, who've never set foot in the places that we call home and have no idea what it is that we have to contribute. So powers over things like skills, local transport, but we're also interested in proposals from the think tank Onward about devolving a proportion of income tax to local areas. I went to Germany recently and saw what they've been able to do with real autonomy about how they spend their money. No more Hunger Games style grants being handed out from Whitehall to mayors who have to scrap for the crumbs that are thrown from the table. We've got to start respecting our communities, respecting our local leaders, and put the power back into their hands.
Can you sip a beer?
That's amazing.
So in your speech there, you talked a lot about housing, and there was a question from someone in the audience. What are you going to do for young people on housing?
Yeah. So whoever it was, you're in big trouble, because this was exactly what I was talking about in the hall today, and there will be a test before anyone's allowed to leave the room as to what we actually announced. It's a really important part of our story about how we're going to change this country. What I announced today were two things. The first is that we're going to restore social housing to the second biggest form of tenure, because social housing, that idea that you have a home for life that you can rent at an affordable level, that gives you security and rights, that you then hand back to common ownership in order that it can be used and passed down through future generations. That is an idea we're fighting for. And our social housing stock has been vandalised under the Tories. It started with Thatcher, and now Liz Truss has come back to finish the job. So we've got 1 million people languishing on waiting lists, waiting for social housing. Many of them forced into the private rented sector, where rents are unaffordable, where standards are incredibly poor in the lower end of the market, and we've got to change that. So we want to make social housing the second largest form of tenure after home ownership. And then we want to make sure that those people who are in the private rented sector, that the balance of power is tilted back to them. So we'll legislate in the first 100 days of taking office for a decent homes charter for private renters that gives real power over your own home, the right to decorate and have your own home and to have pets and all the things that actually give people a basic level of dignity and respect and a quality of life. We've said that we'll legislate to make sure that people can't be turfed out of their home through no-fault eviction. We'll end them, because it's unacceptable that people have to live with that level of anxiety and insecurity only a few months away from losing their home and everything that matters to them. And we'll improve the choices available to private renters, particularly through deposit schemes. A real problem with deposits in the private rented sector, because anyone who's ever rented in London or Manchester or Liverpool will know, and I have, you put up a huge amount of money in a deposit that goes to your landlord and sits in his or her bank account. They earn interest on it that goes back to them, not to you. And when you come to move, and especially if those standards are so low that you need to move, you have to stump up another deposit and often wait months to battle to get your old deposit back. Well, we're going to change that. We're going to make those deposits portable so that they move between landlords, and we're going to make sure that any money that is raised off the back of your money goes back into your pocket. That's just one part of the package, but for us, this really, really is fundamental, because nothing is more important than a home.
Thank you. Of everything you spoke about in your conference speech today, of the ideas you're setting out here, which are going to talk to the growth agenda? Which are, what areas are going to really target and make Labour credible on growth as well?
This is the growth agenda, because getting good jobs back into communities that have seen decades of economic decline, getting money back into the pockets of working people who go out and spend it in local communities and on high streets and in banks and businesses, that's how you create growth, that's how you get this country working again. And to sort of go back to the question earlier about, we're just going to keep regenerating areas over and over again. Well, that's the point, isn't it? Is that it's got to be sustainable. So Keir made a really important speech just before summer recess. The Tory party's implosion somewhat overshadowed it, but it was a big moment for us. Because in it he said, we believe in growth, but we don't just believe in growth at any cost, for any purpose. We believe in growth for a reason, because this is the route to building the country that we believe in. So we're not backing the reopening of the coal mine in Cumbria, because we believe in sustainable growth and that the environment matters and that quality of life matters to people and the safety and the future of our planet matters. We're not just piling money into the city of London and uncapping bankers' bonuses to see if we can hit an aggregate target of growth across the board, because we believe that places matter, the places that we call home, the quality of life that people can expect, and the choices and chances that are not afforded to kids at the moment who have to get out to get on. These things matter, and this is part of a Labour story about how we're going to grow our economy in order to build a sustainable country that works for everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to come to real questions from the floor very shortly, but I wanted to ask kind of what have been your experiences in life, in your constituencies, surgeries, that have made you so committed to the local agenda? What's the driving force for you that's where the answer lies?
That's a good question. I think one of the most formative experiences for me actually was my first job at university was that I was a housing caseworker for a fantastic MP called Neil Gerrard, who was Stella Creasy's predecessor in Walthamstow, and just watched as the housing crisis in London meant that many, many people just didn't have the foundations of a decent, richer, larger, more dignified life, which should be the goal of any socialist government worth its salt. And I then left that because I sort of thought politics was dead and really awful. Here I am, back again. And I went off to work for Centrepoint, which is the youth homelessness charity, one of the best charities in the country in my view. And we worked with these young people, and I'd gone into that job really believing that the answer was the state, and that the state would fix it for them. And what I found actually was that those young people were the answer. They understood the challenges that they faced better than anybody else, and they knew better than we did how to fix them. It taught me, for example, that the public services that we've created fail far too many people in this country because they don't value the one thing that allows people at a time of crisis to rebuild, and that is relationships. If you've got a social care system that moves you miles away from your family as you grow older, or separates couples in care homes so that you can't grow old with the person that you love. If you've got, you're a child who goes into care, and I've worked with many over the years, and you're put in a foster care placement that is hundreds of miles away from your home, you don't just lose your family, you lose your friends, your teacher, you lose the relationship, the one thing that sustains you with your auntie or your granddad or your friends, the one thing that sustains you at the time that you most need it. The system drives the coach and horses through it. It doesn't just fail to protect them, it actively destroys them. And what they taught me most of all as brilliant kids, and I then went on to work with refugee children at the Children's Society, and now work with refugee and asylum seeking children, is that no matter what we did to those children and the barriers that we put in their place, and with asylum seeking children we were working in Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre, we were working with children who were being forcibly made destitute because their parents had been told they didn't have the right to claim asylum in the UK. They never ever lacked ambition, and they never gave up hope. By putting power back into their hands, by pulling the system in behind them, by doing our job, we enabled them to do theirs. And that's how things started to change and things started to get better. So it was those young people, it was those children that changed me. And I think about them still now, I still know some of them now. One of them, a young woman that I met in Yellswood Immigration Detention Centre, who had tried to take her own life after being separated from her mum. And I met her in a hospital in Bedfordshire where she'd been shackled to the bed with handcuffs after trying to slit her wrists. That young woman has gone on to work for the Children's Society and to help a next generation of young people come through. She is the most incredible young woman. There are lots like them. They inspired me then and they inspire me still.
Thank you. I heard something in when you were talking about Walthamstow and how you didn't want to work in politics there. You didn't like it. What didn't you like, and do you like it now? Like, what's your pros and cons of being in politics?
If there are any aspiring MPs in this room, do not let me put you off. But, I mean, democracy is hard. Democracy is hard and democracy is messy, I suppose, because life is hard and life is messy. And in a democracy, you have to convince people that change is necessary. And I think that has been my learning experience over the last decade, is that you don't just go into rooms and talk to people who agree with you. You go out and make the argument every single day. That's the only way that you're going to build a change that lasts, because people have to feel that it's their change. They have to choose it, they have to be rooted in it, they have to accept it. There are no shortcuts. So it can be incredibly frustrating. But the reason that I ended up back in politics was I stood for the council, actually. I was a local councillor before I was an MP in Hammersmith. And the reason that I did that, I was partly a young person, actually. It was a 16-year-old who'd been put into a bed and breakfast accommodation when there was a real housing crisis, and young people then, they weren't a priority. 16 and 17-year-olds who were with their families were fast-tracked for new housing because families were covered by the legislation. 16 and 17s who were on their own were left to fend for themselves. And this young woman had been sexually assaulted by the owner of this B&B and left in the B&B still. And she was, when I went round to see her, she had the door locked and she was terrified. But she convinced me that there was a better way of rehousing those young people, to give them supported accommodation and then to move them into the private rented sector with support and tenancies that meant that they could move and live wherever they wanted to, like many young people, and work and study, which made it less costly because they weren't going into social housing. But they did have the support and the security packaged around them that social housing would have afforded. And I went to see an amazing councillor called Steve Cowan at Hammersmith Council, who later became my fellow woman councillor and drove me absolutely round the bend because the man has so much energy that we could never keep up with him. But he said, well, we'll do it then. I couldn't believe what he just heard about what's happening to a young person in his patch. And he said, we'll do it then. And within a year, they took all of the 16 and 17-year-olds out of bed and breakfast accommodation in Hammersmith, moved them into supported accommodation. They did it at neutral cost. And then he went to see Yvette Cooper, who was the housing minister, and persuaded her to legislate so that young people who were 16 and 17 could be fast-tracked out of that accommodation. What it taught me in the end is that politics, the circumstances of those kids' lives were often set because of power. Because some people had power and some people didn't, and they most certainly didn't. And for all the great work that we were doing supporting in the voluntary sector, only politics can change it. So I came right back, and I've been fighting ever since to change the balance of power in this country, and I will fight till the day that I die until that job is done. I'm going to take 2 questions from the floor. Put your hands in the air. I'm going to come to right at the back, and right at the front and the right here. Do you want to go first?
Okay.
I know what your question is. We talked about it.
Sure. I'm going to be a bit more specific.
Yeah.
So I see that you're a fantastic advocate for localism.
We will repeat the question for those who... Oh, actually, let me lend you the mic so that people can hear you. There you go.
I see that you're a fantastic advocate for localism. What Gove did, though, was married that up to planning law. And developers, private companies, build communities, and planning law enables them to do that. So how would a local government, a Labour government, go about enabling, creating planning law to build communities from bricks and mortar?
I can answer that in a very short way. You will be hearing more from Keir Starmer about that tomorrow, but you didn't hear that from me. Our colleague, sorry, the question, do you want to just repeat?
So the question was, how will Labour change the planning laws to drive growth?
To create bricks and mortar communities.
Yeah.
To create bricks and mortar communities and ensure that you're bringing developers and local leaders and other local actors together to get those houses built. And I was just saying, we'll hear more from Keir Starmer about that tomorrow, but you absolutely didn't hear that from me. And get off Twitter, everybody, or I'll get in trouble.
I have to now tell you that our colleague here works for Planning Magazine, so he's got an eye scoop.
I knew this would get me into trouble.
There's no story until tomorrow.
Our colleague at the back, you're going to have to shout, but I will repeat it.
Okay. I think levelling up as a remit obviously covers a huge amount of things. During the last recovery, when businesses were kind of getting orders in again, one of the things I remember them complaining about was a sort of lack of skills. At the last Labour government we had the Education and Skills Council, I think it was called, which helped further education in areas, and as you'll know, that's a really important aspect of kind of localism, because basically, although you could get an English degree in almost any major city in the north, there are particular industries that need particular skills, so they need further education. I wondered what Labour's plan is there, because it's just gone to, what's a non-swear word?
Feel free.
Yeah, it's gone to crap under the Tories, basically. It's all from Whitehall now, it used to be decided on more local. And as a kind of sneaky question, second question, the Conservative response has been free ports, so what's Labour's opinion on that?
Yeah, so just for colleagues, I think the question was about localised skills planning. Is that what would Labour do on localised skills?
Specifically FE.
Specifically FE. Now I've forgotten the second half, but let's do the first.
There was a bit on free ports as well, and what the Tory answer was free ports. What do we think about that? We don't think much of that, to be honest. This is. I spoke to Simon Clark last week. This is a sort of slash and burn approach. These investment zones that they're talking about, they aren't new. George Osborne tried enterprise zones. We've had lots of these zones over the years. What is new, though, is that they're just trying to slash and burn all regulation to get as many houses built as possible. Luxury houses, they're going to get. I think they're going to get rid of the affordable housing provisions, and then you're going to get these luxury houses built wherever they can, while the rest of us can go and grind away in an Amazon warehouse, which will grow up because they're going to cut taxes for big companies to invest in those places, and watch these luxury houses being built all over our green open spaces. So it doesn't sound particularly brilliant to me. I don't think it will work. I don't think it will create growth, and I think they literally know the price of everything and the value of nothing, and that is the era that we're now in. One of my criticisms of the way that the government, the last Tory government, the one consistent feature, by the way, of all these Tory governments, Cameron, May, and Johnson, and now Truss, is Truss. She's been in every cabinet and she's voted for every single decision, so don't ever let them tell you that this is a break with the past. It absolutely is not, and she should own the failure of the last 12 years. But one of my criticisms of the Johnson version of levelling up is that they talked about moving jobs. They didn't talk about creating jobs, and they didn't talk about skilling up young people in order to get those jobs. I'm going to say something a little bit controversial in this room, and I say this just for context. I spent my life working with asylum-seeking and refugee children before I came into Parliament, so don't get cross with me. But one of the problems that we had when we were in the Brexit referendum, when people like me were advocating for Remain in many towns across the country, is that people were very angry at a settlement where we'd said we can bring in lots of people to work in our economy, to work in social care, to work in the hospital, nursing and other professions, but we'd taken away all of the things that allowed them to get those jobs, the nursing bursary, the education maintenance allowance, aim higher, the whole ladder that enabled young people who literally could see the local hospital, but for whom it was in reality as far away as the moon in terms of what they could expect. And we were saying to them, you should be glad people have come to work here. And they were saying, well, what about me? Now, the what about me part is the bit that I'm really interested, because, yeah, what about them? If you move 500 jobs from Darlington, from London to Darlington in the Treasury, what have you actually done for Darlington, unless you're investing in young people so that they can get access to that good skilled work? So alongside the announcement that Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband were making about this wealth investment fund, about getting good jobs back into those communities, we've got a COVID recovery fund that Bridget Phillipson announced a few months ago, which is about investing in the young people in those areas. And the missing bit of that jigsaw is that strategy has then got to be driven locally, which is why we would devolve skills powers to leaders in those areas, so that they can actually make sure that they're skilling up young people for the jobs that exist and the jobs that they're creating. Just one last thing, I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit too long, but a few years ago, the Cameron government decided to launch airstrikes against Libya, and I got a phone call from my college principal who said to me, they've frozen everybody's bank accounts and I really need your help. And I said to her, why have they frozen everybody's bank accounts? And she said, because when you do airstrikes against a country or effectively go to war, any national of that country in the UK has their bank account frozen and their assets frozen. And I said to her, no, I get all of that, but why are the Libyans in Wigan? And she said, because we've got this amazing legacy at our college, which I knew, of engineering skills that we used to teach engineering from our days, powering this country and running the mines. But we were teaching young people from all over the Middle East those skills. They were coming from all over the world to study at Wigan and Lee College. But the courses that we were teaching our young people were health and social care and hair and beauty. Not bad courses by any stretch of the imagination, but not engineering, because those jobs didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Now, if you gave powers to my council leader and to Andy Burnham and to local business leaders and to the college to come together to create that strategy, they would invest in those kids and those kids would be getting those jobs because they'd be creating them. That's the prize, that's what's on offer, that's what we could deliver, so that those young people have choices and chances and we rebuild the country from the ground up.
2 more questions, and then Lisa is staying around for a drink. So
we're going to put the party back into the Labour Party.
I'm going to give the mic to you, and then
Thank you. When Lucy and I joined the Labour Party, Clem Attlee was the Prime Minister. He lasted 6 years. Subsequent Labour governments managed 4 years, 5 years, 4 years. It was only Tony Blair who managed 13. What can the next Labour government do to ensure it lasts more than 13 years?
God, look at the level of ambition now. 3 years ago we said that we'd seen our entire Labour base collapse in every nation and region of the UK. And I came to conference saying we have a mountain to climb and trust to rebuild, and that break is painful, but it doesn't have to be permanent. But I wasn't sure, actually, that I really believed that. And to be here today and to have that question from someone who's been around and seen the Attlee government and every Labour government since, and to have you asking me why we haven't set out plans yet to make sure that we last 1, 2, 3 terms, it is brilliant, isn't it? This is a movement that has recovered its confidence. That's how we're going to win. Woo!
Okay, see so many young people. I mean, obviously each year they look younger.
What we have to hear this.
Obviously each year they come to conference. These people around look much younger than we do. That's obvious. But we come just to make renewed hope that we go back and we think, well, we know we're we're in good hands, and yes, you're gathering for us. So, thank you.
I was looking at the young people, thinking those who couldn't hear, the lady at the front was just saying that they come every year and they've got renewed hope because of all the young people here. And then I think you mean me as well, which is probably the best thing that's happened to me this conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, I was this is relevant. I was brought up in Glodick in Oldham, which Lisa will know if other people don't know, and worked my way up. I taught in Hume, Moss Side and Wythenshawe. This background is relevant because I became a head teacher, but I'm also the mother of 4 boys. Middle class, privileged, spoiled boys who have no idea, middle class spoiled boys who have no idea what it's like. But they're still struggling. I am still paying deposits for my 4 boys to have accommodation. My youngest is in London, paying £750 a month, and I'm paying this deposit for him to get a flat. So I agree that the priority is the poor, the uneducated, the disenfranchised. But we've got to win over those. They're Labour voters because they don't dare be otherwise. But they're becoming questioning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the battle, I've long thought, particularly with Johnson and the sort of, the way that he degraded politics, and he tried to suggest that, everybody was the same, and he tried to pull Keir and Angela into that over the issue in Durham. And I have long thought that the battle for the next election is not a battle against the Tories, it's a battle against that sort of cynicism that the Tories have fueled for the last 12 years. And there's a line from Bobby Kennedy that I often think about at the moment, where he said in a speech years and years ago, some men see things that are and ask why, I see things that never were and ask why not. And I think that has got to be our mantra. This country can be fundamentally different. The last Labour government really started to change that. We rebuilt our great northern cities from the ashes of the Thatcher era. And we started to open up those opportunities to young people in every part of the country to grab hold of opportunities that would have been unthinkable for their parents and grandparents. And we always intended, talking to John Prescott about this the other day, they always intended to continue to roll out that great rebalancing of power and wealth and opportunity right across the system. And I came to this conference this week to say that we're going to finish the job. And I just say one other thing. I think there are moments when change becomes not just likely or necessary, but inevitable. And I think this is one of those moments. We've had these huge seismic political upheavals over recent years. It's been a difficult time to be in politics. I think for all of us, difficult enough to be in the Labour Party, but difficult to be in politics at a time when we've been so divided against one another. The rising nationalism that we saw, the growing support for UKIP in towns that have consistently chased off the far right over and over again. We've seen these, the vote to leave the European Union and the pitting of Leave against Remain. And I've learned in that time that a house divided can't stand. But there's a moment now where I feel that the whole country is looking to the future. They're not angry because they're not angry because they don't believe things can be better. They're angry because they know things can be better. This is our moment when we take anger and frustration and we turn it into hope and we turn it into change. And that is what I am determined. It's what Keir is determined. What Angela's determined. It's what we are all determined that we're going to do. But we only do it with every single person in this room, in every community in this country, so that we can deliver for all the people in all of the places. That's the thing that's on offer. And I'm so excited to be here with you all today, because I think you know it. I think we know it. But now I think the country knows it. So we're going to go out and we're going to win.
Thank you so much for doing this with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Local Press for helping us put this together, and thank you all for coming and asking such brilliant questions. Do stay for a drink. If it runs out, shout at me. Okay?
Yes, great. Thank you.